February, I beat a Medieval, which is a first-person shooter Quake-like game that I had seen forever ago. It's not super old, but I didn't play it fresh out of the launch. I definitely got it later in this year. Um, and I had gotten it because I was looking into making a first-person shooter for uh, like a personal project. I thought it would be interesting to. I felt like making a game that was like Quake seemed relatively easy compared to some other ideas that I had. That isn't to say that making any game is easy. Trust me, I know. Uh, but I felt like a first-person shooter that had a very simple premise. Quake is sort of the one of the flag bearers of how first-person shooters should be made, especially simple ones. Right. I don't want to talk too much about Quake, but I'm going to this video because what I like about a Medieval is that it is very much like Quake. And I had played Quake last year, and so I then played a Medieval this year, and it was really interesting to compare the two in my head as I was playing and after I played. Because it's cool to see when you have an iconic game like Quake, a game that is older than me, and then you see someone else sort of take the same concept, like just really look at the same concept and be able to focus in directly on a single pinpoint game for like, this is what we're going to reference. You know, some other things you're pulling from whole genres where you're pulling little bits and pieces from other things, but Quake is such a touchstone that you can really see games that are directly influenced by it. And the Medieval is very obviously Quake. And I think that's cool. And Quake is really interesting in its own way because it is very much a game that is like gameplay over everything. And a Medieval is also like that. And so the goal is for me to not just say a Medieval is like Quake and Quake is good, but that is one of the larger takeaways. I had plenty of issues with a Medieval, issues that I did not necessarily have with Quake, and issues that I had with a Medieval are likely because I had played Quake first and had something very close to compare it to. In the same way when you see all these Souls-like games come out from indies, and you're able to see how directly they're referencing, you're able to compare them so much more closely. And it's just so much harder to kind of stand on your own and not be compared to the best when you are directly pulling from the best, right? When you're not pulling from a bunch of other things, you have to be compared to the only thing you're pulling from. And if that thing happens to be the best, then you also have to try to be the best. And that's hard. It's really hard. But anyways, a Medieval had some things that I really liked. Several things even. I really loved that it was like Quake. I loved that it was simple. You could just get in there and kill some things, guys, enemies, creatures. And there was just like 7 different worlds that each one you could kind of play in a sitting. And they're all visually distinct and beautiful. I mean, it's got this extremely vibrant, but gorgeous art style that is low poly because I'm certain they used some like old school level editor to build them out. But it also has this beautiful texture work and the lighting. It's got ray tracing that I played with. And so these worlds are beautiful and they're filled with these enemies that you can just get in there and kill. And it's fast and frenetic. And all the things that I loved about Quake are also true in a Medieval. And so that was great. I was able to just kind of, I love a good think game, like a game that's got a great story and really makes you kind of think through things. But at the same time, I really love the other side of the spectrum where it's just like brain off, mouse, keyboard, you're just going. You're just killing guys, or you're just farming plants or whatever. You're crafting things. Something that doesn't really ask you to pay attention, but it does ask you to pay attention. You know, like some people throw in the word like podcast game, like a game that requires you to have like half your brain engaged, but the other half can be totally distracted by something else, and it doesn't really hinder your experience at all. And I think a Medieval is a bit intense for like a podcast game, but it is sort of that same level of just you go in there and you just start going, and it just makes your brain feel good, or at least it makes my brain feel good, right? You just sort of can let go of thoughts, and it occupies the parts of your brain that make you think the thoughts you don't want to think, and it just leaves that your brain busy but not busy. And I think that's great, and I think they succeeded in that. Um, but more specifically, right? I think Amid Evil is great because it captures Quake in the ways that it needs to, which are that it's fast. It's a fast game. You're moving at the speed of sound like all Quake characters should. Um, you've got this huge, varied arsenal of weapons, some of which I didn't use, which I think is a weakness of the game. But some of them are really creative. And I really enjoyed both the design of them and sort of how they played. Some of them I enjoyed the design of them, but I didn't enjoy how they played. For example, there's like a trident weapon that shoots out lightning bolts. And then the lightning bolts, if you shoot a single target enough times, they will explode. And then if you keep shooting, those lightning bolts will kind of scatter to nearby enemies. And that's a great idea. I think it's so cool. The lightning bolt is so, it's such like a iconic like visual, and the idea of shooting lightning and then having it like just keep shooting at it while shooting at like the already dead enemy and having those lightning bolts scatter to the nearby enemies is like a great concept. In practice, I wasn't able to aim well enough or maintain a single target well enough to really pull that off. And so you can see how there's sort of this difference in the concept and the actual kind of doing it in practice. But that isn't to say that the concept isn't cool and that I don't admire the concept itself. Things that this was unsure of, like things that I loved, both the concept and the weapon. There's like this one where it looks kind of like a branch and it pulls these planets or these little orbs that look like planets and you just launch them. It's effectively a rocket launcher, but the reskinning of it to this like weird fantasy thing that pulls these planets that you launch and then they explode was really cool. And visually, I really liked how it felt like this staff that was pulling these interdimensional orbs, and then you were throwing them at these guys. And of course, any weapon that does ridiculous amounts of damage and can kill you with splash damage is going to be a cool weapon. And so I think there's a lot of merit in the weapon design, and that has to be true because in a Quake-like game, and like Amid Evil is, the weapons are so much of the focus, right? That is your only way of really interacting with the world. And so the weapons have to be exceptional. And I think, oh, and another thing that Amid Evil I really liked about was I think it was like the alt fire, where you could enter this like super mode, and it was different for each weapon. And so you'd gather up, enemies would drop like souls, and you'd gather up those souls to fill up a meter, and then you could trigger a button to expend the meter to get the super mode. And it was sort of, it's like an ultimate, essentially. And I really liked that because you were able to sort of cash up or fill up on souls, and then when you encountered a big group of enemies, you could just use this to sort of clear the room. And each one was different. And so the one that I always used was sort of this basic staff that shot out little like missiles, but then its ultimate move was it shot out just like a ton of missiles, like all these orbs would go out. And that was great. Like it was just like a huge burst in damage. And that's something that if it wasn't like a temporary consumable, it wouldn't feel as powerful because you didn't like earn it as much. And so I really liked that sort of ramp up and payoff of that mechanic, and that it was different per weapon. It wasn't just like your character had an ultimate ability. It was each weapon had an ultimate ability, because your character doesn't really exist. The weapons are the characters in a Quake-like game. And so it was great. And being able to choose the weapon for the encounter, right? Sometimes you were encountering a bunch of little guys, and so you wanted a weapon that could clear out little guys, or sometimes you were encountering like a big tanky bad guy, and so you needed a weapon ultimate that like you knew would just do single target damage that just like ruins a guy. And I like that you could make that decision and that you had to kind of use this extra meter, and it added like a little extra layer that isn't there in Quake. And so I like to see that sort of wrinkle thrown in, right? You need to differentiate yourself from the source material when you're making a clone game or inspired by a game. And I think Medieval was able to do that. I think that's a lot. That is the majority of what I really loved about that game, and what I want to talk about here was the weapons. I think the other thing that goes both ways is the visuals. I think in some ways they tried to sort of spice up the Quake feel by making it really vibrant and colorful, which I do believe is beautiful. I think it's a gorgeous level. But I also see that when playing, sometimes it would get a little muddy, you know? The enemies are bright and colorful, the map is bright and colorful. Sometimes it's just hard to tell what you're looking at. But again, I don't think that should diminish from the visuals on their own. I just think that sometimes they clashed with the gameplay. But there's a distinction to be made there. Anyways, that's a Medieval, or at least what I can remember from it. I'm kind of recording this many months later. But I think it's cool. I think if you like Quake, you will like Medieval. But I also think that Quake stands up on its own, especially with the new remasters that have come out. It is still easy to play Quake, and Quake still is a great game. Really one of those like timeless games that is surprisingly fun, especially for kind of folks who like fast-paced first-person shooters. So check them both out. I think some people, if you haven't played them, give them a shot. They're short campaigns, you know, a dozen hours or so. Yeah, they're cool. I don't know how to end these videos. Whatever. See you next time.